Hi, I'm Dr. Emily Block, and today we're going to talk about some cognitive biases that shape the ways we make decisions on a daily basis. Heuristics are mental shortcuts, things that your brain does to simplify information processing. Rules of thumb that help you make sense of the world and make decisions quickly. For example, if you're walking home alone and you hear a loud noise, your brain will likely recognize that as a sign of danger, causing you to increase your awareness and speed up your pace. But when heuristics go wrong, they can get in the way of logical thinking. This results in cognitive biases, which are systematic errors in thinking that affect your decisions and your judgment. There are many cognitive biases, and they operate differently. Some biases shape the way we remember past events. Others are related to what information we pay attention to and what information we don't notice. They can also influence how we make causal inferences. The thing about biases is that they're subtle, subconscious, hidden, but they significantly influence the ways that we make decisions in negative ways. They are errors in thinking that limits our ability to be objective, logical, and systematic, leading to poor decision-making and bad judgment. In this video, we'll cover several common cognitive biases and then strategize the ways that we can combat or correct for them. There are two broad categories of biases. The first category of biases is in the way that we process information. They shape the things that we notice and how we evaluate the information we use to make decisions. The second category relates to the ways that we judge ourselves and judge others. In this video, we are going to focus on the first category, information processing biases. These include confirmation bias, availability bias, representativeness bias, anchoring bias, and the escalation of commitment, also known as the sunk cost fallacy. Our first information processing bias is confirmation bias. My stepdad is left-handed, and he's really oddly proud of being left-handed. He thinks that left-handed people are more creative than right-handed people. So whenever he meets a left-handed person, he asks them tons of questions about the ways they're creative in their lives and what they like to do. He then accumulates this as evidence that supports what he already believes, that left-handed people are better than right-handed people. This is an example of confirmation bias, when we favor information that conforms to our existing beliefs, and we discount evidence that doesn't conform to those beliefs. We also ignore information that disputes our expectations. We're more likely to remember and to repeat stereotype consistent information and to forget or ignore stereotype inconsistent information, which is one way stereotypes are maintained in the first place, even in the face of disconfirming evidence. For example, if you learn that your new Canadian friend hates hockey and loves sailing, and that your new Mexican friend hates spicy foods and loves rap music, you're less likely to remember the stereotype inconsistent information about each of your new friends. One more example is Facebook. Facebook's algorithms that determine what goes in our newsfeed is such that we're only exposed to information that supports our preconceptions. This makes it really easy to be subject to confirmation bias. To combat confirmation bias, ask yourself, what parts of this did I automatically agree with? What parts did I ignore or just skim over without realizing? How did I react to the points which I agreed or disagreed with? Did this post confirm any ideas that I already had? Why? What if I thought the opposite of these ideas? The second information processing bias is the availability bias. I have a question. Which job do you think is more dangerous, being a police officer in Chicago or working as a logger? While high-profile shootings in the news and the many reruns of Law and Order that we see every day may lead us to think that being a cop is really dangerous, loggers are actually much more likely to die or be injured on the job than police officers. In fact, if we look at the statistics about the number of injuries per 100,000 people per profession, police officers don't even crack the top 10. This is an example of availability bias. It's when we place greater value on information that comes to mind quickly and vividly. We tend to overestimate the likelihood of similar things happening in the future. Here are some more examples of availability bias. Lottery winners are reported in the media, and the large amounts of money usually make a big impression on people who see these reports. You never see the thousands of poor schmucks who have spent hundreds of dollars on lottery tickets but never win. It is easier to call to mind the big winners than it is to calculate the odds. That's why people buy lottery tickets. After seeing several TV programs on shark attacks, you may start to think that these types of things are relatively common. When you go on vacation, you may refuse to swim in the ocean because you believe the probability of shark attacks is high, even though it's pretty unlikely. After natural disasters like earthquakes, people are much more likely to buy earthquake insurance than when there has been a long period of time since the last disaster. The availability bias serves a purpose. It can help us go about our lives doing day-to-day things that probably would really scare us if we thought about the risks. I had a colleague who once told me that he could never travel to some of the places that I work in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa because he has children and he wouldn't want to take any unnecessary risks. It was hard for me to not remind him that he was in more danger driving to work every day than I was probably during one of my visits. But imagine how hard it would be to get up every day and drive if we were acutely aware of the risks. Instead, we bring to mind all the times we drive and get there safely, and it helps us not dwell on the risks. The next information processing bias is representativeness bias. Here's an example. Steve is shy and withdrawn, invariably helpful, but with little interest in other people or the world of reality. He's a meek and tidy soul. He has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. So what do you think is more likely Steve's occupation? Is he a salesperson or is he a librarian? A lot of people guess that he's a librarian because, like Steve, libraries are quiet, untidy places. This ignores some pretty important facts. There are lots of quiet and tidy people that are in many professions, and there are way fewer librarians than there are salespeople, especially male librarians. Representativeness bias happens when people wrongly believe that the similarity between objects influences their probability. Steve's example is an insensitivity to base rates. The base rate, in his case, that there are far more salespeople than librarians. Other subtle ways that representativeness bias can manifest are through the conjunction fallacy, insensitivity to sample size, the misconception of chance, and assumed similarity. Consider this example. Laura is 31, she's single, she's outspoken, and she's very bright. She majored in econ at university, and as a student, she was really passionate about the issues of equality and discrimination. Is it more likely that Laura works at a bank? Or is it more likely that she works at a bank and is active in the feminist movement? The second option is a subset of the first option. Because of that fact, the second option actually can't be more probable than the first. The odds of Laura's behaviors following into a narrower subset must be statistically lower than the odds of her following into the larger group. This is the conjunction fallacy, when it's assumed that specific conditions are more probable than a single general one. This often involves insensitivity to sample sizes. For example, when playing roulette, we feel better betting black after a streak of reds, even though the probability is the same over, let's say, 100 or 1,000 spins of the wheel. You just started investing in stocks. The first 5 stocks you purchased went down in price soon after you purchased. You think the 6th purchase has to go up, right? The odds are in your favor of making 1 out of 6. But when people invest in stocks, they often look to those that are performing well in the past. But we know that performance is often mean reverting, and periods of above average earnings are statistically above average. So we fall into the insensitivity to sample size bias. We extrapolate large-scale patterns to samples of a much smaller size. Our trouble navigating the sometimes counterintuitive laws of probability, randomness, and statistics leads to the misconception of chance. Remember, the representativeness bias happens when the similarity of objects or events confuses people thinking regarding the probability of an outcome. People frequently make the mistake of believing that 2 similar things or events are more closely related than they actually are. When shopping for a used car, what do you look for? Dents, you lift the hood, you kick the tires. If everything looks clean and shiny, you think to yourself, wow, this is a well-maintained car. If the car is dirty, has old food wrappers, or a strange hockey smell, you probably don't think that it's well taken care of. You may feel better buying a cleaner car, but it doesn't actually replace looking at maintenance reports or getting it checked out by a mechanic. We often assume that if the car is clean, that it's in good working condition. To combat the representativeness bias, ask yourself, am I assuming correlation here? The fourth information processing bias is the anchoring bias. Consider these scenarios. Credit card minimum payments. They're set pretty low, and when people are considering what to pay, they often pay that amount or use it as an anchor to pay a little bit more. This causes people to maintain higher balances on the cards, resulting in more fees for credit card companies. Charitable donations. Have you noticed that charities usually don't ask you how much you'd like to donate? Instead, they usually offer you a list of suggested donations. These serve as anchors that are usually set higher than most people would naturally give. Anchoring bias is when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we learn. That's why sellers set the price of goods. Anchoring and adjustment is a psychological heuristic that influences the way people intuitively assess probabilities. Start with an implicitly suggested reference point, the anchor, and make adjustments to it to reach their estimate. You can use this bias to set the expectations of others by putting the information on the table for consideration first. And anchoring is not always about money. How old should your kids be before you allow them to date? Your kid argues that his or her peers are dating at 14, but you were raised to believe that 16 is the minimum dating age. The anchoring effect leads you to believe that 16 is the earliest age that a kid should be allowed to date. How long do you expect to live? If your parents live to a ripe old age, you may automatically expect that you will also live a long life. Because of this anchoring point, you might ignore the fact that your parents lived a healthier, more active lifestyle that probably contributed to their longevity, whereas you eat really poorly and are mainly sedentary. How do we combat the anchoring bias? Make a point to consider all the available information and all possible other information. The fifth and final information processing bias we'll discuss in this video is the escalation of commitment, or sunk cost fallacy. If you aren't familiar with the term, you're surely familiar with the concept. You call the airline, you get put on hold, which is fine because you're not in the middle of anything anyway. So you stay on the line and keep holding and holding, trying not to listen to the repetitive, annoying music in the background. And suddenly you look up at the clock and it's been an hour. And you were planning on going for a run with your friend. But you've already been on the phone for so long. Do you really want to hang up now? Throw away that whole hour? This is the escalation of commitment. It's a bias that results from an ongoing commitment when we continue behavior based on the amount of time or energy or resources that we've already invested in the past, rather than based on the expected value of additional future investment. This manifests because of our bias toward loss aversion. We prioritize not losing or avoiding losses than winning or maximizing opportunity. With sunk costs, we take loss aversion to the extreme, when we care so much about not losing the investments we've already made that we commit to throwing resources at it regardless of whether they're smart investments. These resources can be money, or time, or even the emotional energy that comes with having committed to a course. We don't like to admit that we've been wasteful. In the case of being on hold, sure, I'd already spent an hour on the phone, and if I hung up now, I would never get that hour back. But the reality is, I won't get it back anyway. And the 60 minutes that I've already spent weren't really that valuable of minutes for me. I was multitasking, and it didn't really stop me from doing anything that I wanted to do. But I like running, and it's a nice day, and I've made a commitment to my friend. And for those reasons, each additional minute I spend on hold going forward is actually more expensive than the 60 minutes that I've already invested, because the time is more valuable invested in something else. We encounter this escalation of commitment, or sunk cost fallacy, everywhere, and it often costs us much more than a running date. What do you do when you have a project at work that's failing to produce, even after years of working on it? When do you decide to stop throwing more money into repairing that car? When do you decide that it's time to move on in a relationship? All these things are hard to walk away from, even if the return on any future investment isn't a good deal. Sunk costs inflate prices, and keep failed political policies alive. They make you finish your meal even though you're already full. They clutter your home with things that you don't need anymore. So how do we overcome sunk costs? First, remember the big picture and factor it into your calculations. That means writing down what you really want to achieve and referencing it often. That way you can give more thought to the long game while you're making decisions rather than just focusing on the present moment. Number 2, the past can't be reversed. Don't look back, look forward. Make sure you calculate all the ways you could be using your resources going forward, paying particular attention to the opportunity costs of continuing on the same path. 3, set your walkaway point before you start. That could be a threshold or a deadline that triggers you to reevaluate your investments. That way, you don't find yourself drifting into sunk costs. Finally, find value in losses. We often let a loss linger and grow in our minds. Refocus on the lessons you learned from the experience and try to let the loss go. Can you think of a time when you were impacted by any of these cognitive biases? Were you able to overcome them? What will you do differently next time? Thanks for watching.